Early in the 20th century, Henry Edwards Huntington rode a red interurban car past the last houses of Los Angeles into open bean country where no city yet stood, and he owned both the car and the ground it ran toward. The line he was laying would grow to more than 1,000 miles of track at its peak, 60 and more separate railways folded into one across 4 counties. Its first route opened on the 4th of July, 1902, a network widely regarded as the largest electric railway on Earth. What the map did not show was that the railway was never the point. The land was. His name is not hidden. It sits on a beach, a lake, a library, a hospital. What is buried is stranger. A seaside town would rename itself to honor the man whose trolley was coming to sell its lots. A mountain lake 250 miles away would carry his name. The largest electric railway in the world, as most then reckoned it, would be sold by the man who built it at its height, its rails torn out and paved into the freeways that replaced them, the fortune washed clean into a library. Chapter 1. The Empire. He was denied. The man who would one day decide where Los Angeles grew did not begin by building a city. He began by expecting to inherit one that already stood, and he was turned away at the door. Long before the red cars, before the bean fields hardened into boulevards, before a town on the coast rewrote its own name to flatter him, there was a nephew waiting on an empire he was certain would fall to him. The empire he built instead, to answer that refusal, would in time be torn up and paved under freeways. But it began as a wound. Henry Edwards Huntington was born on February 27, 1850, in the small town of Oneonta, in upstate New York. His name carried weight before he had earned any of his own, because it belonged first to another man. His uncle was Collis Huntington, one of the Big Four, the 4 Sacramento merchants who financed the Central Pacific and then drove it eastward and southward into the Southern Pacific, the railroad that held the commerce of the American West by the throat. To be a Huntington in those years was to stand beside the largest private machine in the country. Henry did not merely stand beside it. He went to work inside it. Across the 1870s and 80s, he served his uncle throughout the sprawling operations of the Southern Pacific, learning the business not from a distant boardroom, but from the yards and the ledgers, the timetables, and the labor gangs, the 1,000 small frictions that move freight and passengers across a continent. He proved careful, patient, and tireless, where other heirs of great fortunes proved merely idle. He handled the tangled details his uncle had neither time nor temperament to sit with. Year by year he made himself indispensable, the lieutenant closest to the center, the man the old financier trusted to carry out what the old financier decided. And in California, what the Southern Pacific decided was very nearly law. The road set the freight rates that could make a farmer or break him. It chose which towns would thrive on a spur line and which would wither for the want of one. To hold the leadership of that railroad was to hold a hand at the throat of an entire state's economy. This was the inheritance Henry believed he was preparing to receive, and to those who watched the succession of great American fortunes, the question seemed already answered. When the old man died, the road would pass to the nephew who had given his working life to it. If you live in Los Angeles today, or anywhere across the 4 counties his lines would one day stitch together, you have likely already formed a verdict about men who build on this scale, whether or not you know his name. To some, he is the maker of the modern basin, the man whose ambition summoned a metropolis out of dry grass and bean rows. To others, he is the speculator who laid a beloved public railway for private gain and let it decay once the profit was banked. The account that follows takes no side. It sets down only what he did and the order in which he did it. Collis Potter Huntington died in 1900, and the empire did not pass to Henry. Control of the Southern Pacific was bound up not in family loyalty, but in bonds and in the men who held them. A representative of those bondholders, the financier James Speyer, moved against the nephew's succession and blocked it. In the settlement that followed, Henry was made to sell his interest in the road to a rival, the railroad financier Edward Henry Harriman, who was assembling a great rail combination of his own and would fold the Southern Pacific into it. The nephew, who had spent a quarter of a century preparing to lead the most powerful railroad in the West, was handed a check instead and shown the door. He was not ruined. He was rich, suddenly and enormously, holding the proceeds of a lifetime's stake sold off in a single stroke. But he had been refused the one thing the money could not purchase back, the empire he had been raised to command. The insult was exact, and he took its full measure. He had done everything correctly for decades, and it had counted for nothing against a ledger of bonds and the will of men who had never turned a switch or read a timetable in their lives. What a smaller man might have nursed as grievance, Henry Edwards Huntington converted into direction. If the established road in the north was closed to him, then he would go where nothing was yet established, where no board of bondholders and no rival financier held any standing to block him, because there was as yet almost nothing there worth fighting over. He turned his refused fortune and his railroad mind southward, toward a dusty, half-formed town on a wide coastal plain that the great railroads still treated as an afterthought at the end of the line. Denied one empire, he set out to build a larger one in a place where no one had the power to deny him. And the ground he chose was Los Angeles. Chapter 2. He bought the streets first. The place he chose to build was not a city so much as the promise of one. Los Angeles at the turn of the century was a low, sun-bleached sprawl of adobe and new brick on a wide coastal plain, ringed by bean fields and orange groves and dry brown hills, its streets thick with dust in the summer and mud in the winter rains. To the great railroads of the age, it was a terminus and little else, the last stop on a long line, a town still waiting for a reason to become something more. Henry Edwards Huntington arrived with his refused northern fortune and a lifetime spent inside the machinery of railroads, and he looked at the half-made town the way a man looks at raw material. He did not begin with a grand interurban reaching for the horizon. He began with the streets themselves. In 1898, before most of the country had heard his name apart from his uncle's, Huntington moved to acquire the Los Angeles Railway, the modest network of narrow-gauge electric streetcars that already threaded the young city. These were the local cars, the yellow cars, small and slow and confined within the town, carrying clerks and shopgirls and day laborers the short distances between home and work and market. They were not glamorous, and they were not yet the thing his name would come to mean. But they moved and they earned, and they ran on rails he now owned. Before he laid a single mile of anything new, Huntington had bought the veins of the city that already stood. Then, in 1901, he founded a second railway, and this one he built to leave the city entirely. He called it the Pacific Electric Railway, and its cars were painted a deep red that would become the most recognizable color in Southern California. Where the yellow cars were narrow gauge and stayed within the streets, the Pacific Electric was standard gauge and heavier, built to run fast and far across open country on its own private right-of-way. Its offices and its downtown hub rose at 6th and Main, in the heart of Los Angeles, a great terminal from which the red cars would one day fan outward in every direction. Huntington did not finance it alone. He gathered a syndicate of partners and investors to stand behind the new line, men with capital enough to match his ambition, but the design and the direction were his, and the road answered to him. That he built two railways rather than one, and kept them deliberately apart, seemed at the time a small and technical decision, the kind of choice an experienced railroad man makes without ceremony. The yellow cars of the Los Angeles Railway would do the close work of the city, the short crowded runs that filled a streetcar's coffers with nickels. The red cars of the Pacific Electric would do something no streetcar had been built to do. They would reach out past the edge of the settled town, across miles of empty plain, toward places that were not yet towns at all. The two systems ran on different track, served different distances, and answered different purposes, and the separation between them was not an accident of engineering. It was the first faint line of a plan that had not yet shown its shape. That plan announced itself on the 4th of July, 1902, when the first true interurban line of the Pacific Electric opened for service. It did not run to Hollywood, which was then a small temperance village of a few hundred souls, nor to any of the fashionable places the red cars would later make famous. It ran south, to Long Beach, out across the flat coastal country to a modest seaside town on the edge of the Pacific. On that opening day, the cars carried thousands of curious riders down to the shore and back, a public spectacle of speed and reach, an electric road striking out into open land where the city simply stopped. To the crowds along the route, it looked like the future of travel, and in a sense it was. It was also something else, though almost no one watching the red cars run that bright summer day would have thought to name it. For while Huntington was laying track toward Long Beach and drafting the lines that would follow it, he was also quietly attending to the ground the track would cross. The open plain the red cars pushed through was not, to him, mere distance to be covered between one town and the next. It was land, cheap and empty and waiting, and a man who knew exactly where the next line would run also knew exactly which fields were about to become worth something. The railway was the visible enterprise, the thing with a color and a schedule and a terminal at 6th and Main. What moved beneath it, in deeds and options and unhurried purchases, had no color at all. In the space of 4 years, a single private citizen had come to own the streetcars that carried a city to work and the interurban that would carry it outward into the country beyond. He held the rails within the town and the rails leaving it, the near traffic and the far. It was an extraordinary thing for one man to command the movement of an entire growing region. It was stranger still once the reason for it was looked at closely. Huntington had not spent his refused fortune to become a carrier of passengers. The streetcars and the red cars were the instrument. The purpose lay in the dirt they ran across. Chapter 3. The profit was in the dirt. The strangeness of it only deepens the longer one looks at it. Here was a man who had spent his entire life inside railroads, who had just laid the first miles of what would become the largest electric interurban system anyone had yet seen, and yet the railroad itself was never the thing he meant to sell. The cars and the track and the great terminal at 6th and Main were real enough, and they carried real passengers who paid real fares. But the fares were never where the fortune was to be made. To understand what Huntington was actually building in those first years, one has to stop watching the red cars and begin watching the ground they ran across. Consider the plain the interurban crossed on its way to Long Beach. Mile upon mile of it was nothing but bean fields and dry grass and open grazing land, worth very little for the plain reason that it was far from everything, reachable only by a long and dusty journey from the edge of the settled town. How does an empty field of beans and dry grass become some of the most valuable land in America, with nothing yet built upon it? The answer was not farming, and it was not luck, and it was not the slow accident of a city spreading outward on its own. The answer was the track. Land that a family could reach quickly and cheaply from the center of Los Angeles was worth many times the price of land they could not, and the single thing that decided which was the red car line. A field with a trolley stop was a suburb waiting to be sold. The same field without one was still only a field. Huntington decided where the line would go. And so Huntington decided, in advance and very nearly alone, which fields were about to become worth a fortune. The instrument that turned that private knowledge into money was quiet, and it wore a plain and modest name. In 1902, the year after he founded the Pacific Electric, Huntington organized the Huntington Land and Improvement Company. It was not a railway, and it did not pretend to be one. Its business was the ground itself, the land that lay along both of his systems, the near acreage beside the yellow cars in the city and the far acreage beside the red cars beyond it. Working through that company and the syndicates that stood with him, Huntington bought up large tracts of the cheap and empty country before the public had any way of knowing where the next line would run. He bought it at the price of farmland, the price of dirt that grew beans. Then, into the land he already held, he laid the track. What followed was almost mechanical in its certainty. The red car reached the tract. A station rose beside the rails. A subdivision was drawn across the raw acreage, the streets named and graded, the lots surveyed and offered for sale. And the very ground he had purchased as worthless distance he now sold as valuable proximity, at the far higher price the railroad itself had manufactured. The order was the whole secret of it. Buy the land first while it is cheap, build the line into it second, and let the line create the value, sell the lots third, and take the profit the track had made. Seen in that order, the arithmetic of the enterprise turns over and shows its underside. The railway did not have to earn its keep as a railway at all. It could carry passengers at a loss, run half-empty cars out to places that were barely towns, charge fares that never came near covering what the line had cost to build and to run, and none of it would trouble the ledger, because the money was never meant to arrive by way of the fares. The money came from the dirt on either side of the rails. An ordinary railroad sold transportation and lived or died by it. Huntington's railroad sold nothing of the kind. The red car was not the product. The red car was the thing that made the product worth buying, and the product was the land. There is a cold elegance in the arrangement that the familiar story of the red cars misses entirely. A streetcar company that loses money is a failing business. But a streetcar company owned by the same man who owns the land it runs toward is not losing money at all. It is spending it, on purpose, out of one pocket, to make a great deal more of it from the other. Every mile of track Huntington laid was at once a public convenience and a private lever, a thing that moved people and a thing that moved the price of ground, and it was the second purpose that paid the bills of the first. The riders who climbed aboard on a bright summer morning saw an electric railway reaching bravely out into open country. The man who owned the railway saw a subdivision that had not yet been drawn. It is one thing to describe a mechanism in the abstract, in the dry language of tracts and options and rising prices. It is another thing to watch it work upon a single piece of ground that carries a name. For the pattern did not remain a theory. It ran again and again along every line the red cars pushed outward, and in at least one place beside the sea, the land it transformed would repay the favor in the plainest manner imaginable. It would take for its own the name of the man whose trolley had made its dirt worth buying. Chapter 4. The Town That Took His Name. The detail that the familiar histories pass over is the smallest and plainest one of all, hidden in a thing so ordinary that no one thought to read it as evidence. It is the name. Along the coast, southeast of Los Angeles, where the interurban would one day run out toward the water, there sat a modest and struggling settlement that its founders had christened with a hopeful and slightly grand name. They had called it Pacific City, after the great ocean at its doorstep, and, one suspects, after the far larger San Francisco to the north, in the manner of small places that name themselves for the cities they hope one day to become. Pacific City was not becoming anything. It was a scatter of lots on a bluff above a good beach, remote from the settled town, reachable only by the long overland journey that made all such distant ground cheap, and its lots did not sell. What Pacific City lacked was the one thing Huntington was in the business of supplying. It had the ocean and the beach and the bluff, and it had space without end. And it had none of the value that only nearness to Los Angeles could confer, because it was not near Los Angeles in any way that mattered to a family deciding where to buy. It was near in miles and far in hours. The single instrument that could close that distance was the electric line, and the electric line belonged to the man in the great terminal at 6th and Main. Then came the syndicate. In 1903, the investors who held the town site reorganized themselves as the Huntington Beach Company, and control of the ground passed to a group standing with Huntington himself. The town was renamed to match its new masters. Pacific City became Huntington Beach, not for a battle fought there, nor for a family that had settled it, nor for a founder who had died to hold it, but for a railway owner who had done, at the very moment of the renaming, almost nothing at all in the place. He was honored in advance. The town took his name the way a merchant takes a note of credit, on the strength of a payment that everyone concerned understood was coming. The payment came in the form of track. Huntington extended the Pacific Electric down toward the coast, and by the summer of 1904, the red cars were running into Huntington Beach, carrying the day trippers out of the city to the sand in the numbers that a good beach and a cheap fare could draw. And the lots that had sat unwanted under the name Pacific City began to move under the name Huntington Beach, at prices the older name could never have commanded, for the plain reason that a family in Los Angeles could now reach the place in an hour of easy riding rather than a day of hard travel. Nothing about the sand or the bluff or the ocean itself had changed. The only thing that had changed was the red car, and the red car had changed everything. Set against the mechanism laid bare in the chapter before, the renaming reads less like a tribute than like a receipt. Here, written into the map of Southern California in letters that no one would ever trouble to remove, was the whole arrangement pressed into a single word. The town did not honor the man for anything he had built there, for at the hour of its christening he had built nothing there. It honored him for what his trolley was about to make its dirt worth. The name was an acknowledgment of the lever, set down in public and permanent form by people who understood precisely where the coming value of their ground would originate and who wished to flatter its source. A place had signed its own deed over to the meaning of the line. There is a temptation to treat Huntington Beach as a curiosity, a lone coincidence of naming pinned to one stretch of coast. It was nothing of the kind. It was the pattern made visible, the single instance where the machinery left its fingerprints in something as durable as a place upon a map, and behind that one visible instance stood a great many others in which the same order of operations ran quietly and left no such obvious mark. The same order of operations that built the fortune had run here too, quietly, as it ran everywhere else across the basin. The cheap ground bought first, the line laid down to lift it, the risen lots sold at the price the track had manufactured. The town beside the sea was only the example that happened to carry a signature. For the line did not halt at one beach or one bluff. It kept pushing outward in every direction the country allowed, season upon season and year upon year, tract giving way to tract, until the matter was no longer which town the red car would reach next, but how much of an entire region a single private network could come, in the end, to hold. Chapter 5. The Web That Swallowed the Basin. The question of how much of a region a single private network could hold was not answered in a day, nor by any decision anyone thought to record at the time. It was answered slowly, over roughly 2 decades, one line at a time, until the answer had grown too large for a single map to show at a comfortable size. What had begun as a pair of systems running out of one downtown terminal became, by degrees that no one could fix to a single date, a thing without evident edges. The red cars did not conquer the Los Angeles basin in a campaign. They seeped into it. A line was pushed to one town because a syndicate held ground there. A branch was thrown out to a valley because dry country could be made to pay. A spur was laid to a third place, and then the third town's neighbors wanted the same, and the network answered the wanting, because the wanting was the entire point. Track begot track. Each new mile of line manufactured new value, and the new value financed the next mile, and the next mile manufactured value further out, and a machine that ran on that logic carried within it no natural place to stop. The manner of the growth was as much purchase as construction. Where a smaller line already ran, it was cheaper to buy the men who had built it than to lay rail beside them. And so the rivals were folded in, one after another, their names retired and their track repainted into the single crimson livery until the red car became the one color the whole basin knew. What had been a scatter of separate little railways, each the private hope of some other builder, became branches of one system answering to one terminal at 6th and Main. By the height of its reach, the figures had passed out of the range a person tends to hold easily in the head. The Pacific Electric ran, by most accounts, on more than 1,000 miles of track. 60 and more separate traction railways had been gathered over the years into the single system. The red interurban cars reached across 4 counties of Southern California, into Los Angeles and Orange and San Bernardino and Riverside, binding towns that had never before had cause to think of themselves as parts of one place. The rosters of the peak, by most accounts, ran past 1,000 cars in the crimson paint, fanning out from the downtown terminal on schedules that carried a rider from the foot of the mountains to the edge of the sea in a single day. It was, by most accounts, the largest electric interurban railway in the world. The scale was not merely a matter of length totaled up. The web changed the shape of the thing it covered. Before the lines came, the basin had been a scatter of separate settlements, held apart by the distances between them, each an errand of hours from the next, the dry ground between belonging to no one's daily life. The red cars dissolved those distances. A family could live in one town and work in another, and take its Sundays at the beach of a third, and the 3 towns, which had been 3 separate worlds, became neighborhoods of a single sprawling one. The interurban did not follow the growth of Los Angeles outward. It went first, into ground where no growth yet stood, and the growth came afterward and settled along the line the way iron filings settle along the pull of a magnet, because the line was the only reason the ground was worth settling at all. Where the track ran, a suburb was possible. Where it did not, the country stayed country. The map of where people would come to live was drawn, tract by tract, by the map of where the rails were laid, and that second map was the private property of one man. At this point, the account of Henry Huntington ceases to be the account of a railway. A railway is a business with rivals and receipts, a thing that can be set beside other railways and found larger or smaller. What had grown out of the terminal at 6th and Main was no longer only that. It was the circulatory system of a region not yet built, the set of channels along which a coming population would be carried and settled, and the man who owned the channels owned less a company than the shape the future city would be pressed into. The historians who came after reached for the language of empire to describe it, and by the plain measure of territory the word held. An empire is counted in the ground it commands, and the ground this one commanded was the whole floor of the basin, from the mountains down to the sea. The interurban web was the most visible of Huntington's works, the one that carried his cars and his color out where anyone in Southern California could see them pass, and in time the public would mistake it for the whole of what he had built. It was not the whole. It was the largest such machine ever laid across an American basin, and it was still only the second of the 3 levers he meant to close his hand around. The first had been the land, and the land and the rails together already made a fortune larger than the one he had been denied. The third was the current itself, the power that turned the wheels of every red car on every one of those 1,000 miles. And to take that lever into his hand, he would leave the flat country of the basin altogether and go up into the Sierra Nevada to dam a river more than 200 miles from the city his trolleys served. Chapter 6. He dammed the Sierra for current. Every red car that ran on every one of those 1,000 miles ran on electricity, and electricity, in the first years of the century, was not a thing a railway could simply order and have delivered at the scale a growing empire required. It had to be made. A network that meant to keep pushing its track out into empty country year upon year needed a supply of current that would grow as quickly as the track did and never once fall short of it, for a stalled car sells no ground. A man who had learned to hold the land his rails made valuable was not the sort to leave the power those rails depended upon in another owner's hands. And so Huntington reached for the third lever, the way he had reached for the first 2, by owning the source of it outright from the water down. His instrument was a company called Pacific Light and Power, and the place he chose to build was not the flat basin his trolleys served, but the high granite of the Sierra Nevada, roughly 250 miles to the north and east of the city, where the snowmelt of the mountains gathered into rivers and began the long fall toward the valleys below. The plan was as plain in its logic as the land scheme had been. Water that falls does work, and work turned into current is a thing that can be sold to every wheel and every lamp in a region learning to run on it. The Sierra held more falling water than any use yet found for it. Huntington meant to find the use. In 1911 and 1912, his company began the great undertaking in the San Joaquin High Country that would come to be called the Big Creek Hydroelectric System, a chain of dams and reservoirs and powerhouses strung down the descent of the water like a series of locks reading the mountain in reverse. It was among the largest works of its kind attempted in the American West to that date, laid across country so remote that a railroad had to be cut into the mountains first, merely to carry the concrete and the steel and the men to the sites where the dams would stand. Crews worked at altitude through the mountain winters. The water was caught high, held, and released through the turbines, then caught again lower down and released again, so that a single body of snowmelt was made to turn the wheels not once, but many times on its way to the plain. From the top of the system to the bottom, the water fell more than 6,200 feet through the cascade of powerhouses, dropping farther under harness than any other worked stream in the country, until in later years men would call it the hardest working water in the world. In 1913, the first great reservoir of the system was finished, an impoundment held behind a dam near 7,000 feet up in the range, a sheet of cold blue water where before there had been only a meadow and a creek. It was given a name. It was called Huntington Lake, after the man whose company had summoned it out of the mountain, so that the same figure who had put his name on a seaside town and would put it on a library now put it on a body of water in the high Sierra as well. He had not merely bought the current, he had dammed a river to make it, and had signed the making with a lake that carried his name 250 miles from the nearest track his money owned. The current came down out of the mountains along lines strung across the intervening country and reached the basin as electricity for sale, and there it did the double work the whole machine was built to do. It turned the wheels of the red cars on their 1,000 miles so that the interurban Huntington had laid was fed by the power Huntington had made, one hand supplying the other. And it lit the towns the cars had called into being, the lamps and the shops and the new houses of the tracts that the rails had made worth building, so that the same growth which filled the cars with riders filled the meters with load. Land raised the value the track manufactured. Track carried the settlers the land was sold to. Power ran the track and lit the land, and was itself another asset, metered and billed, returning on the same population the other two levers had gathered. Each of the three fed the other two. None of the three stood alone. By 1913, then, one private citizen held all three in a single hand. He owned the ground on which a coming city would be built, the rails that decided which ground it would be, and the current that moved the rails and lit the ground. The land, the web, and the water answered to one man, and each made the others pay. It was a concentration of the means of a whole region's growth that no council had granted, and no election had approved, and the man who held it was not finished acquiring. He was about to be called, by those who studied it afterward, something stranger than a railway magnate or a power baron. He was about to be called the planner of a city that had never chosen him. Chapter 7. The Map No One Elected. Had the man stopped there, in 1913, with the three levers gathered and turning, the shape of what he had built would still have been strange enough to trouble the people who came later to study it. Even before he added a single further mile or acre, what Huntington held by that year was not three businesses that happened to sit near one another. It was a single instrument with three moving parts, and the instrument did something no private fortune was supposed to be able to do. It decided the future ground of a city. The decision itself was a plain thing, once its parts are laid out. A stretch of open country south or east of the town, bean fields and dry pasture worth little because no one could easily reach it, became worth a great deal the moment a red car line was surveyed toward it, for the line meant that people could live there and still travel to their work in the city each morning. The country did not choose where the line would go. The county did not choose. No board of citizens sat in a chamber and weighed which valley should become suburb and which should stay in barley. One man chose, in an office, by deciding where his own track would be laid, and the land his track approached became the next quarter of the growing city while the land it bypassed stayed as it had been. He was not merely building where the city was going, he was telling the city where to go. How does a single private citizen come to decide where a city of millions will grow? The fullest answer belongs to a historian, William Friedrichs, who spent years inside the company's own records and set his findings down in a study published in 1992, argued that the answer lay in the very concentration this story has been tracing. Huntington's control of the street railways, the electric power, and the real estate, all three held in one hand, gave him what Friedrichs called a virtual monopoly over the development of many parts of the Los Angeles basin. He built his trolley lines, in the historian's phrase, where and when he wanted, and in doing so he determined the spatial layout of the area. Friedrichs did not reach for the word lightly. He called Huntington the de facto metropolitan planner of Southern California. The force of the phrase lies in the two words at its center. A metropolitan planner is ordinarily an office. It is a public body, answerable to a council or a mayor or the voters beneath them, charged with drawing the lines a region will grow along and open, at least in principle, to being argued with and overruled. Huntington was none of that. He was a private man spending private money for private return, and the historian's point was that in the Los Angeles of these years, the private man did the public body's work because there was no public body strong enough to do it. Local planning commissions, in that time and place, held little regulatory power. They could not compel a railway to run one way rather than another, could not hold back a subdivision, could not draw a map and make a landowner honor it. So the map was drawn anyway, by the one party with the rails and the power and the acres to draw it, and it was drawn to sell land. There is a plainness to the arrangement that is easy to lose under the romance the red cars later acquired, the routes that a later generation would remember as a beloved public system, the lines that carried clerks to their offices and families to the shore on a Sunday, were laid along the paths that a real estate calculation had chosen. Where the calculation pointed, the track went, and the houses followed, and a district of the city was born that no one had voted into being. Where the calculation saw nothing, no track went, and the ground waited, sometimes for decades. The living pattern of a great region, its centers and its edges, and the empty seams between them that remain empty still, took the shape it took in part because of choices made in a single office to the logic of a single ledger. Friedrichs was careful, and the care is worth keeping. He was making an argument, not reading out a confession. Huntington nowhere sat down to design a city, and the growth of Los Angeles had 100 other authors. The climate and the oil and the water brought from far away, and the great migrations still to come. But the claim, narrowed to what it actually says, is hard to set aside. When one man holds the rails that decide access, the power that decides whether the ground can be lived on at all, and the title to the ground itself, and when no public authority stands over him with a map of its own, then the man's private decisions become the region's public form. The city grows where he lays his track, because he lays his track where the city will pay him to grow it. It was a map that no election had approved, and no council had drawn, held in a single hand by 1913 and still filling out year upon year. And the man who held it, having spent some 15 years assembling the most extensive interurban railway most observers believed the world had yet seen, was on the point of doing the one thing that fit none of the romance and all of the logic. He was about to sell the most famous part of it. Chapter 8. The Day He Sold the Red Cars. The timing of it was almost too neat to read as an accident. In the same handful of years that Friedrichs would later fix upon as the height of Huntington's grip on the basin, the years when the rails and the power and the land had at last been drawn into a single working instrument, the man who held that instrument sat down and sold the most visible part of it. He had spent the better part of 15 years laying the Pacific Electric across 4 counties, and now, with the network still pushing out and the name Red Car already fixed in the affection of a whole region, he let it go. The Great Merger, the arrangement came to be called, and it fell across the 2 years of 1910 and 1911. What he sold was his controlling interest in the interurban. The Southern Pacific, the very railroad his uncle had built, and the one from whose succession he had once been shut out, took up the Pacific Electric and folded into it the 60 and more separate traction lines of the region, drawing the tangle of competing electric railways into a single company under a single owner. The red cars did not stop running. The name did not change. To a rider stepping aboard at 6th and Main the morning after, nothing whatever was different. But the man whose initials the public had fastened onto the whole enterprise no longer owned the railway that carried them. Why would a man sell the railway that carried his name across the whole basin at the very peak of its reach? The answer is the same cold answer this account has been circling from the start, and it lies in what the railway was actually for. The Pacific Electric had never been, in the plain sense a ledger would recognize, a profitable railroad. As a business of carrying passengers from one place to another and charging them fares, the interurban lost money, and it lost money in the ordinary course of doing exactly the thing it was built to do. Its worth to Huntington had never been in the fares. It was in what the track did to the ground on either side of it. The line was the loss leader, the deliberately unprofitable thing run at a loss because it lifted the value of something else, and the something else was the land. Seen that way, the sale stops being a puzzle and becomes a settlement. A loss leader is kept only so long as it is still doing its work. The interurban had done its work. It had reached out across the bean fields and the dry pasture, and where it reached the land had been bought cheap and sold dear, and the profit the track manufactured had already been gathered by the land company that existed to gather it. Once the ground along a line had been subdivided and sold, the line had spent its usefulness to the man who laid it. What remained was a sprawling, money-losing railway that would cost more every year to run and to extend, held now for sentiment or for pride rather than for return, and it was for return that the line had been built. And so the merger shows its real shape in what he did not sell. He gave up the Pacific Electric, the famous machine, the interurban that lost money over its enormous reach. He kept the Los Angeles Railway, the narrow-gauge yellow cars that worked the dense streets of the city itself, the urban system that, unlike its glamorous cousin, actually turned a profit on the fares it collected. He kept the Huntington Land and Improvement Company, the engine that had turned track into money in the first place. He kept the power company, Pacific Light and Power, and the current it sold. He let go the part of the empire that cost him and retained every part that paid him, and he handed the expensive, celebrated, unprofitable railway to the one buyer large enough to carry it. If you have followed this account as far as the day the railway, so many called the largest on earth, changed hands, you have already watched the mechanism do all but its final piece of work. What is left is the part the romance would rather not remember. Subscribe to stay with the record to its end, because the machine Huntington sold still has the better part of half a century of slow dying ahead of it, and the story the country would settle on about who killed it is stranger than the quiet transaction that sealed its fate. Pull back from the single sail, and the logic of it stands plain across the whole basin. A private man had built the most extensive electric railway most observers believed the world had yet seen, and he had built it not to run trains, but to sell dirt. And the moment the dirt beside the far-flung lines was sold, he was free to be rid of the trains. The network that a later generation would mourn as a stolen public treasure was, to the man who created it, a tool that had reached the end of its task. He did not tear it up. He simply stopped being the one who owned it and passed the long expense of it to a corporation that would carry the name and the mileage forward for a while yet. He sold the famous machine and kept the quiet one that made money, and the famous machine was now someone else's to maintain and, in its time, someone else's to bury. The largest railway on earth had passed out of his hands with less ceremony than a man might spend on the sale of a house. And having settled the great public instrument of his fortune, Huntington turned to a matter far more private, a piece of family business that would fold back into his hands the very empire he had once been denied. Chapter 9. He married the dead man's widow. The public business of the empire was settled, and what remained was private. It reached back 13 years to the death that had set the whole story moving. When Collis Huntington died in the year 1900, he left behind him two things that his nephew would spend much of the rest of his life gathering back. One was the fortune Henry had been shut out from, the control of the Southern Pacific that James Spare's veto had forced him to surrender and sell away to a rival. The other was a widow. Her name was Arabella Yarrington Huntington, and she had been the second wife of the uncle whose empire Henry had been denied. In 1913, 13 years after Collis went into the ground, and 2 years after the great merger had emptied his hands of the red cars, Henry Huntington married her. The man who had been shut out of his uncle's empire married his uncle's widow, and in the doing he joined to his own holdings a great part of the wealth the elder branch of the family had built, the share of the Huntington fortune that had passed at Collis's death to the woman now at his side. The two branches of the money, divided by one death and one bondholder's veto, were folded back into a single pair of hands. It is a fact best left as a fact. Arabella had inherited a great portion of what Collis left behind, and the marriage carried that portion to Henry. Whatever the match meant to the two people inside it, and the record is thin and guarded upon that question, its effect upon the fortune was exact and easily read. The empire that had been withheld from him at the reading of one will came back to him in altered form through the making of a marriage. The one clear defeat of his early life had been quietly undone, and it had been undone not by a railway or a land company, but by a wedding. Arabella Huntington was not an heiress merely carried along by the arrangement. She was, by the judgment of those who have studied the period, among the most formidable American art collectors of her generation. She bought old masters and the great English portraits of the 18th century, tapestries and rare manuscripts and French furniture, moving through the dealers of New York and London and Paris with a purse that few private buyers on earth could match, and an eye that fewer still cared to argue with. In the years of the marriage, her long appetite for collecting ran together with Henry's own deepening hunger for rare books and British paintings, and the joined fortune became, among the other things it was, an instrument for gathering art on a scale that private Americans had seldom before attempted. Where other rich men of the age bought pictures one canvas at a time, the two of them bought by the collection and by the library, gathering not ornaments for a wall, but the raw material of something larger, though neither may yet have set a name to what it would become. And such gathering needed a place to stand. A decade before the marriage, in 1903, Huntington had bought a working ranch in the San Gabriel Valley, on the high ground north and east of the city, a spread of citrus groves and nut orchards known as the San Marino Ranch. At its purchase, it had been precisely what the land along his trolley lines was, agricultural ground lying in the path of a city that was coming toward it. But this ground he did not subdivide, and this ground he did not sell. This ground he kept. Upon it he began to raise a great house, and about the house the gardens and the galleries that would in time hold the books and the pictures that he and Arabella were assembling between them. The ranch that a lesser calculation would have carved into building lots and sold off along a rail line became instead the one holding he would not turn back into cash, the ground on which a private fortune had begun, quietly, to plan a public mark. So the heir who had been denied had folded his uncle's fortune back into his own, and he had set it down at last upon a hill of orange trees that he meant, for the first time in his long career of buying land, to hold rather than to sell. What he would make of all of it in the years still left to him would outlast every mile of track he had ever laid. For the track had already begun its own slow turning. The famous machine that he had sold was passing now into other hands and into a longer decline, and the nation was preparing to remember the manner of its death in a way that would have almost nothing to do with the truth of it. Chapter 10. The Machine Left to Die. The machine did not fall in a single night. It came apart the way a great thing comes apart when no one any longer needs it to stand, slowly, line by line, over the better part of 40 years, until the largest electric railway ever laid across an American basin had been unwound almost entirely and paved beneath the roads that took its place. The turning had begun even at the height. In the years after the great merger, while the Pacific Electric still ran red across 4 counties and carried more riders than any interurban on Earth, the thing that would undo it was already rolling down the same streets the trolley had opened. The automobile came into Los Angeles not as a novelty, but as a flood. The city that Huntington's lines had scattered wide across the plain, the low and spreading city of separate towns strung along separate rails, was the perfect city for the private car, and the private car did not wait at a junction or keep to a timetable or share its seat with a stranger. The same dispersal that the red car had sold now sold the automobile instead. Every subdivision the trolley had made reachable became, in time, a subdivision the motor car could reach better. And the motor car was not the only rival. Where the rails did not pay, the operators put buses, which needed no track and no overhead wire, and no crew of linemen to keep the current running, and which could be moved from a failing route to a promising one in an afternoon. A bus line could be started with a purchase and ended with a sale. A rail line, once laid, was a debt in the ground, a fixed and heavy thing that had to earn its keep or bleed. Through the 1920s and into the years of the Depression, the arithmetic turned steadily against the rails, and the men who now owned the Pacific Electric, the Southern Pacific that had bought it from Huntington, were railroad men counting a railroad's losses. For it must be remembered what the interurban had been built to do. It had never been built to earn its living carrying passengers. It had been laid down to make the empty land along it worth buying, and the land along it had long since been bought. The lots were sold, the towns were built. The value the track had been laid to manufacture had been manufactured and taken as profit, and carried away into other holdings decades before. By the very logic that had raised the system had already done its work. A tool built to sell land, once the land is sold, is a tool with nothing left to do, and the men who held it now had every reason to spend as little upon it as the law and the public would allow. So it was starved. The maintenance that a rail network devours, the ties replaced, and the rails ground true, and the wires kept taut, and the cars overhauled, was deferred and deferred again. Track that wore out was not always relayed. Cars that aged were not always replaced. Service that thinned drove riders to the automobile, and the loss of those riders was then given as the reason to thin the service further, so that the decline fed upon itself. Each cut in the running made the argument for the next, until a line that had once come every few minutes came seldom, and then hardly at all, and then not. The dismantling can be read as a set of dates, and the dates are exact. Regular Pacific Electric passenger service ended on the 1st of October, 1953. The great red network reduced by then to a handful of surviving routes running out of the old downtown terminal. Those last routes were pared away one by one over the years that followed until the final red car made its final run on the 8th of April, 1961, out to Long Beach, the very line that had opened the whole system on the 4th of July 59 years before. 4 years after that, on the 13th of August, 1965, The corporate name itself was folded away. The Pacific Electric Railway absorbed wholly into the Southern Pacific that had bought its ruin. Within a single human lifetime, less than the span of a long life, the largest system of its kind on Earth had been built, ridden by millions, and taken entirely apart. What became of the road it had run on told the story plainly. The right-of-way that the red cars left behind did not go back to grass. Much of it was handed to the buses that had already replaced the trolleys, and much of it was handed in the end to the automobile itself, the private grades and the reserved medians and the long straight cuts that Huntington's engineers had surveyed across the basin, turning out to be very nearly the ideal path for a freeway. In more than one corridor, the concrete of the new expressways was poured along the same line the rails had held, so that the citizens who drove those roads drove, without knowing it, in the trace of the trolley, above tracks torn up or paved over beneath them. It was a quiet ending for so vast a thing, an ending by ledger and by deferral rather than by any single blow. And a quiet ending by arithmetic is a hard thing for a city to keep in its memory, harder to hold than a villain and a crime. In the years while the last red cars were still coming down, and louder in the years after they were gone, another account of the death began to take shape and to spread, an account with named culprits and a hidden hand, a story that would in time be believed by a great many people who had never studied a single line of the accounts. It would have almost nothing to do with the figures, but it would be the story the country chose to tell about how the greatest railway in the world had come to die. Chapter 11. The Lie About Who Killed It. There is a part of the ending that has never sat easily in the public memory, and it is the plainness of it. A machine that vast, the largest electric railway ever laid across an American basin, does not feel as though it ought to die of arithmetic. Something so large seems to demand a cause its own size, a hand behind the ruin, a crime to answer the scale of the loss. And in the years, while the last red cars were coming down, a cause of exactly that shape arrived, ready-made, and the country took it up and has held it ever since. The story runs a single clean line. The red cars were a great public transit system, quiet and electric and far ahead of their time, and they did not simply fail. They were killed. They were killed by the men who stood to profit from their death, the makers of automobiles and tires and gasoline, who bought the railways to tear them out, to put buses and then private cars in their place, so that a city which might have kept its trolleys forever was made instead to lean upon the motor car the plotters sold. In this telling, the death was not a decline at all, but an assassination, and the assassination had names. The striking thing is that a version of that story stands in the record. There was a company called National City Lines, and it was financed in part by General Motors, by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, by Standard Oil of California, by Phillips Petroleum, and by the makers of buses, and through the 1930s and 40s it bought up streetcar systems in cities across the country and turned them from rail over to bus. And in 1949, a federal jury convicted National City Lines and several of those backers of conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy to monopolize the sale of buses and of supplies to the transit companies they had come to control. That much is not rumor. It is a verdict, entered in a federal court, and it is the hard grain of fact around which the far larger legend has grown. But a conviction for the selling of buses is not a finding about the death of the Pacific Electric, and the whole distance between the two is where the legend outruns the record. The court weighed the monopolizing of supply, The forcing of one company's buses and one company's tires and one refiner's fuel onto the transit lines these men controlled. It did not find, because it was never the question before it, that a thriving and profitable railway had been destroyed to clear the ground for them, and the famous red cars of the basin were never the property of the men in that courtroom. The Pacific Electric belonged, from the great merger onward, to the Southern Pacific, a railroad that counted a railroad's losses and needed no outside plotter to teach it that the interurban did not pay. In Los Angeles itself, the one system the National City Line's interests actually took was not the red cars at all. It was the yellow cars, the urban Los Angeles Railway that Huntington had held back for himself in the great merger and kept because it earned, and they bought it only in 1945, when the long unwinding was already decades underway. Even in the city where the legend is loudest, the men it accuses never owned the trolley it mourns. For the decline had its cause already, and the cause is the one this whole account has followed from the beginning. The interurban had been a loss leader, laid down to sell the land along it, and that land had long since been bought and sold, and its profit carried away. All of it, the automobile taking the riders and the buses, the thin routes, and the upkeep deferred into ruin, was moving before National City Lines was ever formed, and it went on down the same line whether those men sat in a boardroom or a courtroom. Here the two accounts can be set down side by side and left there. Was the greatest railway in the world murdered, brought down by a conspiracy of the men who sold the cars and the tires and the fuel that replaced it, a crime with names attached and a verdict to prove the intent? Or did it die exactly as it had been designed to die, a loss leader built only to sell land, kept running just as long as there was land to sell and let go the very moment the selling was done? I will set the one beside the other and go no further, because the record holds both a conviction and a ledger, and the two do not answer the same question. The Pacific Electric came apart in the space between those two accounts, and the man whose name it had carried across 4 counties was, by the time the unwinding finished, long past any of it. He had outlived the peak of his own railway, and would not live to watch its last car run. The courtrooms and the closures belonged to other men now. He had already turned, in the last years given him, to a different labor entirely, the slow and deliberate remaking of a fortune built on track and dirt and current into something that would stand in white stone above the basin it had mapped, something that no one who walked through it, then or 100 years after, would ever think to call speculation. Chapter 12. The name washed clean. The last labor of his life was the quietest, and it undid, in the public memory, nearly everything the loud years had built. The man who had spent 3 decades laying track and buying dirt and damming rivers for current spent the final stretch of it assembling books, not the ledgers of the land companies. Old books and manuscripts and paintings gathered without haste onto a ranch on the floor of the valley and set behind glass, so that a fortune made in the most modern way a fortune could be made would come at last to rest looking as though it had always belonged to an older and gentler world. The ground for it was already his, and so were the means to fill it. Back in 1903, he had bought the working ranch at San Marino and, alone among his holdings, kept it rather than sold it. In 1913 he had married Arabella, the widow of the uncle whose empire he had once been denied, joining to his own the fortune he had been blocked from inheriting, and a collector's eye trained on European painting. Together, in the years that followed, they gathered paintings and rare books and manuscripts onto the ranch, until a citrus grower's country house held one of the great private collections in America. Then he gave it away. In 1919, he and Arabella signed a trust indenture, a legal instrument that set the whole of it beyond his own use and beyond his heirs. It created an institution and gave it a threefold name: a library, a set of art collections, and a botanical garden. And it bound the books and the paintings and the gardens and the ground beneath them to the public without end. 3 years later, in 1922, a deed made the gift real, conveying his books, his art, and the San Marino Ranch itself out of his hands and into the keeping of the institution that would carry his name. He did not live to see it opened. On the 23rd of May, 1927, far from the basin he had drawn, Huntington died in Philadelphia, on an operating table, under a surgeon's knife, in his 78th year. The railway he had built was by then already past its peak and settling into its long descent, and he had turned his back on it many years before. In 1928, the year after his death, the gates of the estate opened and the public walked in, and they have been walking in ever since. What they came into bore no mark of the machine. A visitor could follow the paths between the roses and the desert plants, could stand in the cool of a gallery before a wall of old portraits, could look through glass at a page of vellum lettered by hand centuries before, and could leave again, having heard nothing of the lost leader, or the land companies, or the empty bean fields into which the track had first been run. The place spoke of learning and of beauty, and of a benefactor's generosity, and it spoke of nothing else. The fortune had gone in one door, as the profit of a railway built to be discarded, and it had come out the other as a library, and the door had closed behind it. The name went with it. There had been a time when the word Huntington, set down on a document anywhere in Southern California, meant a syndicate assembling parcels along a rail line, or a company subdividing a town site, or an owner who could decide from behind a desk which stretch of empty country would next be made worth money. Within a generation of his death, the word meant almost none of that. It meant the library on its hill, the gardens, the paintings, a slow afternoon among the camellias. The name that had sat on deeds now sat on marble, carved above a doorway, planted in a garden, and the marble and the garden were what it called to mind. And none of it touched the ground he had actually altered. The books could be given to the public, and the gardens opened, and the name set into white stone, but the map remained. The lines he had drawn across 4 counties, the towns his track had called out of empty fields, the shape he had pressed into a city that had not yet been built when he began, all of it lay exactly where he had left it. It lay under the new pavement and under the new streets, beneath the feet of every visitor who would ever wander his gardens without once knowing that the paths beyond the wall had been laid by the same hand. Chapter 13. The tracks beneath the freeway. The rails were pulled up, but the lines they had drawn did not come up with them. That is the strange inheritance of what Huntington built. A railway can be scrapped, its cars sold off for the copper in their motors, its ties burned and its stations razed, and still the decision the railway carried out stays pressed into the ground, too deep for any wrecking crew to reach. The red cars are gone. The Los Angeles they were run out to make is where more than 10 million people now live, spread across the floor of the basin in the shape the track first traced. Follow the map of the modern city and the old lines are still there, though almost no one crossing them knows it. The suburbs stand where the interurban stopped. Whole towns exist because the red car reached them before anything else did, called out of bean fields and dry grass by a timetable, and they kept the streets and the lot lines the syndicate had drawn to sell them. The low outward sprawl that the world takes as the native form of Los Angeles, the city with no center that runs from the mountains to the sea, is not an accident of climate or of cars. It is the footprint of a private railway laid down to move real estate, and it hardened into permanence long after the trains that made it had stopped running. Even the freeways obeyed it. When the automobile inherited the basin, the roads that carried it were in places laid along the very rights-of-way the red cars had once run on, the graded corridors already cleared and owned and pointing exactly where the traffic wanted to go, because the traffic wanted to go where Huntington had long ago decided the city would grow. The commuter sitting in the long red evening light on a jammed freeway is often sitting above an old trolley bed, moving slowly along a line chosen for him by a man who died before his grandparents were born. The name rode through all of it untouched. It is on the beach still, and on the mountain lake 250 miles away that drowned a Sierra Valley for current. It is on the library on its hill in San Marino, and it is on a hospital in Pasadena, spoken 1,000 times a day by people who could not say what the man did to earn the carving. The word means a garden now. It means a quiet afternoon among old books and camellias. It does not mean the thing it was. And lately the city has begun, at enormous cost and with great fanfare, to build again what it tore out. In the last decades, Los Angeles has laid new electric rail back across the basin, and some of the new lines run along the same corridors the red cars once ran, the route down to Long Beach among them, so that a passenger boarding a modern train to the coast is retracing, without knowing it, the first interurban line Huntington opened on the 4th of July, 1902. The city spent a generation killing the network and is spending a fortune to approximate it again. So, if you live on the map this man drew, if you ride those new trains along the old beds, if your town wears a name a trolley gave it, or your family came out on the red cars when the fields were still open, follow this channel and keep hearing the histories of the American empires that shaped the ground you stand on, because the ground remembers what the name has forgotten. Go back, then, to where it began. An empty stretch of the valley floor, bean rows and dry grass to the foot of the mountains, no city yet, no name. A single red car pushing out past the last houses into country where nothing had been built, running on a line that was never really about the ride. The rider looked out at emptiness. The man who owned the car looked out at a map. One historian who spent a career in the record, William Friedrichs, judged that the private choice of where to lay that track had made Huntington the true planner of the metropolis, the man who set the spatial layout of the basin from behind a desk while the elected commissions held little power to stop him. He is remembered for the garden. His monument is the city. The railway that so many had called the largest on earth was only ever the means. The end was the land, and the land is the Los Angeles that grew up over the tracks, its millions living out the shape of one man's arithmetic, held fast beneath the freeways that buried the last of his trains.